Winston Churchill called it the Pearl of Africa. And in 1962, when the Union came down for the last time over Kampala and the black, yellow, and red of a new nation rose in its place, the name fit. Uganda was extraordinary, lush green, impossibly fertile. A landlocked country at the heart of the continent where the Nile began its 4,000-mile journey to the sea. Where mountain gorillas moved through ancient forest mist, where the equatorial sun warmed soil so rich that farmers joked plant a walking stick and return to find a tree. The land was a gift. The air was alive. The future in October 1962 felt genuinely open. Independence had arrived with unusual grace, unlike Kenya to the east, where the Mau Mau uprising had soaked the ground in blood before the British finally left. Uganda's transition was relatively orderly, a negotiated handover, a constitutional framework, a new prime minister named Apollo Motombote, who stood at the podium in Kampala and spoke of unity, of development, of a Uganda that would honor its extraordinary diversity and build something lasting from it. The diversity was real and ancient and complex. Uganda was home to dozens of distinct ethnic groups, each with their own language, their own history, their own relationship to the land, and to the idea of governance. The Buganda Kingdom, the Buganda people of the Fertile South, was the largest and most organized. Its Kabaka, a king of genuine historical authority, whose palace sat on Mengo Hill in Kampala, and whose people regarded with deep pride a political tradition that predated the British by centuries. To the north, the Akoli and Langi people of the dry savanna had a different history, warriors, cattle, keepers, people whose relationship with the colonial state had been defined by service in the King's African Rifles rather than by the administrative collaboration the Buganda had offered. To the west, the kingdoms of Bunyoro Toro and Ankol each carried their own internal hierarchies, their own loyalties, their own memory of a pre-colonial world that the British had reorganized around their own administrative convenience. The British had, with the casual genius for division that characterized their colonial management across the continent, used these differences as instruments of control. They had elevated some groups and subordinated others. They had used northern soldiers to police southern populations. They had drawn the Buganda into a protectorate arrangement that gave the kingdom a degree of formal autonomy and generated, in the Buganda elite, a sense of entitled partnership that other Ugandans found insufferable. They had created, in other words, the conditions for the post-independence conflicts that they could then, from a comfortable distance, attribute to African tribalism, rather than to the political architecture they had deliberately constructed. Obote understood this complexity, and tried to manage it through coalition politics, building alliances across ethnic lines, promising federalism to the Buganda, while maintaining central authority, balancing the competing interests of a country that was wealthy in resources and talent, but fragile in the institutional trust that holds diverse nations together. His Uganda People's Congress was a genuine political project. His ambitions for development and autorization were real. But Obote also understood power. And power, in the Uganda of the early 1960s, ultimately rested on the military. The Uganda Army was a colonial inheritance, built by the British from the same raw material the King's African Rifles had used, predominantly northern soldiers, disproportionately Akoli and Langi, trained in the British tradition of discipline and physical toughness, loyal to whoever led them, and paid them, and gave them a sense of purpose in a post-independence world that had not entirely figured out what to do with its soldiers. The army was the state's fist. And the man Obote chose to help him hold that fist, to build and command the military force on which his political survival depended, was a figure who had risen through the King's African Rifles, with a combination of physical dominance, tactical cunning, and an appetite for command that his superiors found impressive and his peers found unsettling. His name was Idi Amin Dada. He was, when Obote chose him, a decorated veteran, a heavyweight boxing champion, a man whose enormous physical presence, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and energy, a face that could shift in a moment from warmth to absolute menace, made him the most memorable person in any room he entered. He was charming in the specific way that men who have learned to read danger are charming, attentive, perceptive, calibrated to what each person in front of him needed to hear. He was also, those who knew him well understood, something else entirely beneath the charm. What that something else was, what it was capable of, was not yet visible to anyone in Kampala in 1962. Not to Obote, who thought he was using Amin as a tool. Not to the British advisors who had promoted him, and thought they understood him. Not to the Ugandan people, who watched the new army parade through their streets, and felt the specific pride of a nation that had its own soldiers now, its own flag, its own future. The pearl of Africa was gleaming. The future was open, and in the barracks of the new Uganda army, a man who had grown up with nothing, and was determined to die with everything was watching and waiting, and learning the only lesson that would ever truly matter to him. In Africa in 1962, the man who commanded the army commanded the country. He filed that lesson carefully away. The rains were beautiful that year. The Nile ran full and silver to the north. The jacaranda trees of Kampala bloomed purple in the streets of a city that believed, genuinely and with the specific optimism of new nationhood, that what came next would be better than what had been. It would not be. Paragraph 2. Origisti Bowaya from Naboa. There are no records of Idi Amin's birth. Not because the event was undocumented in the casual administrative way of rural Africa in the 1920s, though that was part of it. But because Idi Amin himself was never entirely certain when he was born, who his father was, or what the first years of his life actually contained. He gave different birth years at different points in history, 1925-1928. With the easy flexibility of a man for whom official records had never been there available or particularly important. The uncertainty was not a pose. It was the actual condition of his origins at childhood, so marginal, so unwitnessed by the institutions that create official records, that even its subject could not pin it down. What is known is this: he was born in Koboko, in the West Nile region of northern Uganda, near the border with what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo and South Sudan. His mother Aisha, a woman described in the accounts of those who knew her as tough, resourceful, and spiritually formidable, was of the Labara people. His father Andreas Nabar was a Kakwa, a member of a small Muslim ethnic group that straddled the Uganda, Congo, Sudan border, people who had no great historical power in the colonial administrative structure, no particular privilege or protection, and whose Muslim identity placed them at a further remove from the Christian missionaries and their associated educational infrastructure that was already, in the 1920s and 1930s, beginning to produce the administrative and professional class that would eventually govern independent Uganda. Amin's father left when Idi was an infant. Left to an unknown destination for unknown reasons, never to return, never to be a presence in the boy's life in any meaningful form. The abandonment was complete. Amin grew up without a father. In a world where fathers were the anchors of social identity, where a man's lineage defined his place in the community, where the absence of paternal recognition meant the absence of a particular kind of social legitimacy that the communities of the West Nile understood viscerally. His mother Aisha moved. She moved to Jinja, the industrial town on the shores of Lake Victoria, where the Owen Falls Dam would eventually be built, and then to Kampala, carrying her son through the Uganda of the late 1920s and 1930s, a Uganda still firmly under British colonial authority, organized around the hierarchies of race and ethnicity and religion that the colonial system had encoded into every aspect of daily life. She made her living, the various accounts suggest, as a herbalist and a figure in the spiritual landscape of the communities she moved through, a woman of practical intelligence and social resourcefulness, who found ways to survive in a system that had not been built with women like her in mind. Young Idi grew up in this world of movement and marginality. He had almost no formal education, a few years of Islamic schooling, some exposure to basic literacy, but nothing approaching the secondary education that the mission schools were producing for the children of more connected families. In the Uganda of the 1940s, this was not unusual for a boy of his background. What was unusual was what he had instead of education: a body that seemed to have been designed by a particularly ambitious nature, a mind with an extraordinary capacity for reading people and situations, and a personality that combined overwhelming physical confidence with a specific social intelligence that the formally educated would chronically underestimate. He was 17 or 18 when he enlisted in the African Rifles. The year was approximately 1946. And the KAR was the primary institution through which young men of his background, northern Muslim, poorly educated, lacking the family connections that opened other doors, could access the regular wages, the meals, the structure, the identity, and the authority that the colonial military offered. The British Army took you in from nowhere and made you someone. It gave you a uniform and a weapon and a rank and a set of rules that were, for a boy who had grown up, without the stability of any of those things. Not oppressive constraints but genuine gifts. Amin took to military life with a ferocity that his superiors noticed immediately. He was physically extraordinary. Not just large but coordinated, fast, genuinely powerful in the way that comes from a combination of genetics, and the specific toughening of a hard childhood. He became the heavyweight boxing champion of Uganda, a title he held for 9 years. And boxing taught him something beyond physical technique. It taught him the psychology of dominance, the specific discipline of controlled aggression, the way that the threat of violence could be deployed as effectively as violence itself. A man who knows he can destroy you, and who is calm about it, is more frightening than a man who simply attacks. Amin learned to be calm about it. He served in the Kara across East Africa, in Kenya during the Mau Mau emergency, where British forces were conducting operations of considerable brutality against the Kikuyu fighters, where the young Amin was exposed to the specific techniques of military intimidation and collective punishment that the British Empire had developed across a century of colonial policing. He absorbed these techniques with the attention of a gifted student. He participated in operations whose details remain, in many cases, obscure. The KAR's role in the Mau Mau suppression was not extensively documented in ways that reflected credit on its participants. But the lessons were learned. Violence, systematically applied, worked. Fear, carefully cultivated, was more efficient than persuasion. The appearance of overwhelming force prevented the need for its continuous deployment. The British officers who commanded him in these years left contradictory accounts. Some found him exceptional, brave, disciplined, reliable in the field, possessed of a natural authority over other soldiers that could not be trained but only discovered. He was promoted. He was decorated. He was identified as exactly the kind of African soldier the British needed as they began, in the 1950s, to accelerate their preparation for the independence that was coming whether they wanted it or not. Men who'd command the new national armies that would take over from the KAR, who had enough British military culture to maintain the institutional coherence the British had built, but who were African enough to give the new armies the national legitimacy they would need. He was commissioned as one of the first African officers in the Uganda Army in 1961, one of only 2 Africans to reach officer rank before independence. The rank was a signal of how far he had traveled from Koboko. But it was also, for those who could read the situation clearly, a warning of how far he intended to go. The boy who had no father, no records, no education, no family connections, the boy who had been given nothing, and from whom nothing had been expected, was now Lieutenant Idi Amin of the Uganda Army. He was looking at the country that had been given its independence, at the politicians who were running it, at the civilians who were celebrating it, and he was calculating. He had spent his entire life learning how power actually worked, not in the abstract, not in classrooms, not in political theory, but in the specific, physical, operational reality of armed men and their command. He had watched British officers and African politicians and tribal chiefs and learned the same lesson. From all of them, the man with the loyalty of the soldiers had the final argument in any dispute. He was 30-something years old, enormous and magnetic, and already deeply experienced in violence. He had a growing collection of grievances and a growing appreciation of his own strength. He was Milton Obote's man. For now. For now was the most dangerous phrase in Uganda's political vocabulary, and everyone who mattered in Kampala was about to discover what came after it. Paragraph 3. Idi Amin says fast triumphs, teach generals FATCAP, Milton Obote made a calculated bet on Idi Amin. It was not an irrational bet. In the early years of Ugandan independence, Amin was genuinely useful, a military commander of real capability, a man whose physical authority inspired loyalty in the northern soldiers who dominated the army, a figure whose lack of formal education and sophisticated political connections made him appear manageable to a prime minister who preferred his military chiefs to be powerful in the barracks and pliable in the cabinet room. Obote promoted Amin rapidly. By 1964 Amin was a colonel. In 1966 he was a general. The speed of the promotion reflected both Amin's demonstrated capability and political needs. The prime minister was navigating an increasingly turbulent political landscape that required a military enforcer he could trust, and Amin, loyal, effective, and seemingly content with command rather than politics, filled that role with apparent satisfaction. The relationship was tested almost immediately by the first great crisis of Ugandan independence, the Mutiny of 1964. In January of that year, soldiers of the Uganda army mutinied, demanding higher wages, faster Africanization of the officer corps, and the removal of British officers who still commanded significant portions of the force. The mutiny was part of a wider pattern across East Africa. In the first years of independence, soldiers had fought under colonial authority, and now found themselves poorly paid, and under the continued command of the Europeans they had expected independence to replace. In Kenya and Tanzania, the mutinies were suppressed with British military assistance, an embarrassment that the newly independent governments managed by requesting help quietly and accepting it quickly. In Uganda, Obote turned to Amin. Amin handled the mutiny with a combination of personal authority and precisely calibrated force. He walked into the barracks of mutinous soldiers, soldiers with loaded weapons, soldiers who had already confronted their officers, and he talked them down. He spoke to them in their own languages, in the specific register of soldiers addressing soldiers, without the condescension of political authority. He made promises that he may or may not have intended to keep, and he made them convincingly. And where talking did not work, he deployed force with a decisiveness that ended resistance before it could consolidate. The crisis was resolved. Obote was grateful. Amin's reputation as the man who could manage the army, who understood it from the inside in ways that politicians could not, was cemented. But the mutiny had revealed something important about the Uganda army. The Obote and Amin were storing for future use. The soldiers were loyal to commanders who spoke their language, shared their background, and demonstrated personal authority over them. They were not loyal to institutions or to abstractions. They were loyal to men, and Amin was becoming, in the barracks of Kampala, the man to whom the soldiers were most loyal. The political crisis of 1966, the event that Ugandans would call the constitutional crisis, or more simply, the crisis of the Kabaka, was the moment that accelerated Amin's rise while simultaneously revealing the dark mechanics of Ugandan politics. The Kabaka of Buganda, Mutesa Su, King Freddy to his admirers, a man of genuine dignity and political sophistication, who had been trying to navigate the post-independence relationship between his kingdom's autonomy and the Ugandan state's centralizing ambitions, had become an obstacle to Obote's consolidation of power. The conflict between Obote and the Kabaka had been building for years. Buganda's special constitutional status gave the kingdom a of autonomy that Obote found incompatible with the central authority he needed to govern effectively. The Kabaka, whose palace on Mengo Hill was a symbol of a political tradition that predated the Ugandan state by centuries, represented precisely the kind of alternative legitimacy that threatened the primacy of the elected government. In May 1966, Obote ordered the army to attack the Kabaka's palace. Amin commanded the assault. The Battle of Mengo Hill was brief, brutal, and decisive. The palace guard, loyal, courageous, but outgunned, fought with what they had against an army with armored vehicles and mortars. The Kabaka escaped over the palace wall and into exile, eventually dying in London in 1969 under circumstances that were never fully explained. Dozens of his guards and supporters died in the palace grounds. Amin had led the attack personally, had been physically present at the front of the operation, but directing the assault with the kind of direct command that soldiers respected and that politicians preferred to keep a safe distance from. He had gotten his hands dirty in Obote's service, and Obote had watched him do it, and both men understood that a new bond of mutual dependency had been forged. Obote could not easily remove a general who knew exactly how the attack on the Kabaka's palace had been ordered and organized. And Amin could not easily move against a prime minister who had given him the authority and the resources that had made him the most powerful military figure in the country. It was a partnership of complicity. And complicity, as the history of authoritarian politics demonstrates with depressing consistency, does not create loyalty. It creates mutual vulnerability. And mutual vulnerability, under pressure, tends to resolve itself through preemption. Through the late 1960s, Amin continued to build his position. He cultivated the loyalty of specific units, disproportionately from the West Nile, disproportionately Kakwa and Nubian soldiers, whose ethnic ties to Amin himself created a personal loyalty beyond the professional. He used his access to military resources to build patronage networks, rewarding loyal subordinates with promotions, with supplies, with the small benefits that make a soldier's life more comfortable. He began quietly and systematically to ensure that the key command positions in the Uganda army were held by men who owed their positions to him personally. Obote noticed. Of course he noticed. He was not a naive politician. He began receiving intelligence reports about Amin's network building, about the gold and ivory smuggling operations that Amin was apparently running through the Congo. Operations that generated the cash Amin needed to fund his patronage independent of the official military budget. He began to hear, from trusted advisors, that the army's loyalty was increasingly personal rather than institutional, that Amin had positioned himself not simply as a general, but as the army's patron, its protector, its personality. By 1970, the relationship between Obote and Amin had become openly adversarial. Obote began restricting Amin's authority, appointing officers loyal to the president to key commands, sending units loyal to Amin to distant postings, laying the groundwork for what Uganda's political community understood to be inevitable confrontation between a president who needed to control his army, and a general who had outgrown being controlled. In January 1971, Obote traveled to Singapore for a Commonwealth conference. He had intelligence suggested, already decided he would return and move against Amin, arrest him, charge him with the financial irregularities that were well documented, remove him from command before the general could act first. Amin moved first. On January 25, 1971, while Obote was still in Singapore, the Uganda army moved out of its barracks. Key installations across Kampala were seized, the radio station, the airport, the central bank, the government ministries. Loyal units took up positions at road junctions across the capital. The Presidential Guard, whose loyalty to Obote had made it a target, was overwhelmed. By morning it was over. Amin's voice came over Radio Uganda at 6 in the morning. A military government had taken power. The constitution was suspended. Parliament was dissolved. The government of Milton Obote was at an end. In London, the Ugandan community heard the news with a mixture of shock, and in some quarters, particularly among the Baganda who remembered the attack on the Kabaka's palace, a cautious provisional satisfaction. Obote was gone. What came next was unknown. The first calls from Kampala to London, from Ugandans trying to understand what had happened to their country, carried the same question: who is Amin? Really, what does he want? What comes next? The answers would come. In time, in blood, in a cascade of horrors that would transform the Pearl of Africa into a byword for the specific madness that unchecked power produces in a man who has never, for a single day of his life, been required to answer to anyone for anything. Pirala tefo piam, o feferanzamo ffa and I iron feist. The world was charmed. This is the fact that history requires us to sit with uncomfortable, instructive, and essential to understanding how the catastrophe that followed was able to build to the scale it reached. When Idi Amin Dada seized power in January 1971, the international response was not horror. It was, in many quarters, something disturbingly close to relief. The British government recognized his regime within days. Not grudgingly, enthusiastically. Obote had been moving Uganda in leftward direction, had been nationalizing industries, had been cultivating relationships with the Soviet Union and flirting with policies that alarmed British commercial interests in East Africa. Amin, by contrast, presented himself in those first weeks as a soldier, straightforward, anti-communist, pro-British, happy to reassure the expat community and the business interests that their Uganda was safe now. The British High Commission in Kampala sent glowing reports back to London. The Foreign Office was pleased. The army had sorted out the mess. Israel extended recognition. Amin had cultivated a relationship with Israeli military advisors, had visited Israel, had been trained by Israeli officers, had apparently expressed warm feelings for the Israeli state and a willingness to cooperate militarily. The Israeli government saw in Amin a potential ally in a region where alliances were fragile and geopolitical positioning mattered enormously. The Ugandan public, at least in the initial weeks, was more cautious, but not uniformly hostile. The Baganda, still raw from the attack on the Kabaka's palace and the exile of their king, welcomed the removal of Obote with a specific, and their communities watched and waited. The professionals, doctors, lawyers, academics, civil servants, hoped that a military government might at least be organized, might bring stability after the political turbulence of the late Obote years. Amin performed the opening act of his regime with considerable theatrical skill. He freed political prisoners. He announced that elections would eventually follow. He spoke warmly of reconciliation, of healing the divisions that Obote's politics had created, of building a Uganda that worked for all its people. He was accessible to journalists, remarkably so, given Mwaka views with a disarming openness, laughing, telling stories about his boxing career, displaying the enormous personal warmth that coexisted, in his personality, with the capacity for casual violence. He invited the body of the Kabaka, still in London, to be returned to Uganda for a state burial with full honors. He was seen in those months as the kind of populist military leader who might actually make things work. And simultaneously, invisibly to the cameras and the diplomats and the optimistic editorial writers, the killing had already begun. It began with the soldiers. The Uganda army in January 1971 was not monolithic. Obote's army had been dominated by Akoli and Langi soldiers, northerners, yes, but from different groups than Amin's own Kakwa and Nubian network, and critically, soldiers whose loyalty to the deposed president made them potential threats to the new regime. Amin understood this with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life in military institutions. A general who does not control his entire army is vulnerable. And the soldiers he does not control will eventually be used against him. The solution was characteristically direct. Akoli and Langi soldiers began disappearing from their barracks. The disappearances were quiet at first, individual soldiers failing to report for duty, units being redeployed to remote postings from which they did not return. Then, as the weeks became months and the months became the first year of Amin's rule, the scale became impossible to conceal. Bodies began appearing in the Nile, in forest clearings, in detention facilities where the sounds that came from behind closed doors were not the sounds of interrogation, but of systematic slaughter. The Malaya Mechanized Regiment massacre. The killings at Jinja Barracks. The mass graves that investigators would eventually locate across the country. These were not the excesses of a system under stress. They were the deliberate, organized elimination of a potential military threat, conducted with the institutional efficiency of a military operation, ordered from the top. Estimates of the soldiers killed in the first year of Amin's rule range from several hundred to over 1,000. The exact number will never be known. What is known is that by the end of 1971, the Uganda army that Amin commanded was a fundamentally different institution from the army he had inherited. Ethnically purged, politically reliable, loyal to its commander, through the specific bond of shared complicity in what had already been done. Outside the barracks, the State Research Bureau was being built. The SRB was Amin's intelligence and terror apparatus, modeled partly on the secret police systems of the regimes Amin admired, staffed initially by Nubians and West Nilers whose personal loyalty to Amin predated the coup, and given a mandate that had no legal limitation and no external oversight. They could arrest without warrant. They could detain without charge. They could, and did, kill with complete impunity. Their headquarters on Nakasero Hill, in Kampala became the address that Ugandans learned to fear with a specific visceral terror, the place from which people did not return. The SRB was accompanied by the Public Safety Unit, another security organization that operated with similar methods and similar impunity. Between them, these two institutions provided Amin with what every authoritarian requires: a mechanism for identifying and eliminating threats before they could materialize, an apparatus of fear that made opposition too dangerous to organize, and a network of informers whose surveillance of the population gave the regime early warning of discontent. The international community largely did not want to see what was visible. The bodies in the Nile were attributed to tribal conflict. The disappearing soldiers were explained as desertions or transfers. The journalists who tried to report what was actually happening found their access restricted, their sources disappearing, and their stories dismissed by governments that had already decided Amin was useful, and were not interested in evidence that complicated that conclusion. The expulsion of the Asian community in 1972 was the moment that Amin revealed himself to the world, or tried to. 78,000 Asians, most of them holding British citizenship or residency, were given 90 days to leave Uganda. Their businesses, which formed the backbone of Uganda's retail and commercial economy, were confiscated. Their properties were seized. They were expelled with the possessions they could carry. It was an act of economic nationalism, weaponized as political performance. Amin announced it after claiming that God had appeared to him in a dream and commanded it. He framed it as the economic liberation of African Ugandans from Asian commercial dominance. And in the specific resentments of the post-colonial moment, the framing had genuine popular resonance. The economic war, as Amin called it, was announced to enthusiastic crowds in Kampala who were tired of feeling economically marginal in their own country. The British government, faced with the arrival of 78,000 of their own citizens, was furious. The diplomatic relationship soared overnight. The Israelis, whose military advisors were expelled at roughly the same time in Amin's dramatic pivot toward Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and the Arab world, were outraged. The international press attention that followed the expulsion was, for the first time, substantially negative, covering not just the drama of the Asian exodus, but the violence that had been occurring in Uganda's barracks and detention centers for over a year. Amin did not care. He held a press conference and laughed. He sent a telegram to Richard Nixon offering to marry him. He wrote to Queen Elizabeth suggesting she come to Uganda, so he could teach her something. He sent a letter to Kurt Waldheim at the United Nations, composed in a register so bizarre, mixing threats, jokes, geopolitical analysis, and apparent non-sequiturs in ways that made recipients genuinely uncertain whether the sender was dangerously eccentric or brilliantly calculated. That it was impossible to ignore. He was, it turned out, both. The performance of absurdity was a political strategy. A man who cannot be taken seriously cannot be effectively opposed. A man whose behavior is so unpredictable, so apparently irrational, that no one is quite certain what he will do next, is a man who generates a specific kind of paralysis in his opponents. Amin had learned, in the barracks of his youth and the operations of his career, that terror was most effective when it was unpredictable, when the rules of safety were not clear, when no one could be certain what behavior would attract the regime's attention. He was now applying that lesson to an entire country. Uganda was held in a grip of fear and bewildered compliance, and the man who held it was laughing on the front pages of newspapers around the world, the clown general, the comic dictator, the African buffoon. That was what they called him. And while they were calling him that, he was killing. Paragraph 5. Piek of Papas o Mas Elofs Rapo F. Tara. He gave himself every title he desired. By the mid-1970s, Idi Amin Dada Omi held, by his own declaration, the following titles: President for Life of the Republic of Uganda, Field Marshal of the Uganda Armed Forces, Doctor of Laws, Conqueror of the British Empire, Last King of Scotland. He wore his uniform covered in medals, some earned, many invented, all arranged with the theatrical precision of a man who understood that the appearance of power was as important as power itself. He drove himself through the streets of Kampala in a convoy of Mercedes-Benz cars. He was carried in a sedan chair by British businessmen, by publicity event to humiliate the former colonial power while generating the specific international attention he craved. The performance was comprehensive. But behind it, always consistently, with the systematic efficiency of a military operation, the killing continued. The peak of Amin's power coincided with the organization of African Unity Chairmanship in 1975, a moment of maximum international legitimacy, maximum domestic terror, and maximum personal megalomania, all three operating simultaneously, as if the contradictions between them had ceased to register. African heads of state came to Kampala for the OAU summit and attended a conference at which Amin claimed as a champion of African liberation from colonial and neo-colonial domination. He had expelled the British. He had nationalized foreign businesses. He had aligned Uganda with the Arab oil states whose wealth was, in the mid-1970s, transforming the geopolitical balance of the continent. He was, to a significant portion of the continental political audience, a figure of genuine anti-colonial credibility. The bodies in the Nile were not on the summit agenda. What did the Ugandan state look like at the height of Amin's power? It looked, from the inside, like an iced imp organized entirely around fear. The economy was in freefall. The expulsion of the Asians had not, as Amin had promised, transferred their commercial wealth to ordinary Ugandans. It had given the regime's cronies the opportunity to seize the most valuable businesses, which they then ran into ruin through a combination of incompetence and looting. The businesses not seized were simply destroyed by the uncertainty of operating in a country where property in rights depended entirely on the whims of a man who changed his mind on the basis of dreams and provocations and perceived slights. The commercial infrastructure that had made Uganda one of Africa's more economically promising post-independent states was dismantled in less than a decade. Agricultural production collapsed. The coffee industry, Uganda's primary export earner, survived largely because it was too geographically dispersed to be entirely disrupted. But the revenues it generated flowed to the regime rather than to the farmers and the state institutions that required funding. Inflation became endemic. Basic goods became scarce. The medical system, the educational system, the civil service, all of these began to disintegrate as the professionals who staffed them either fled the country or were killed. The professionals were a specific target. Amin had a particular suspicion of educated Ugandans. A suspicion that was partly class resentment, partly ethnic calculation, and partly the specific paranoia of a man who understood that the people most capable of organizing effective opposition were the people with the education and the connections to do so. Lawyers, doctors, academics, journalists, civil servants of the previous government. These were the people who disappeared into the SRB's facilities and did not come back. The most famous of these disappearances was the murder of Benedicto Kiwanuka, Uganda's first prime minister under colonial rule, a man of great dignity and political stature, who was arrested in 1972 and killed in detention. Kiwanuka was Muganda. He was Catholic. He was educated. He was precisely the kind of Ugandan whose existence represented an alternative authority, an alternative legitimacy, an alternative vision of what Uganda could be. He was killed for what he represented as much as for anything he had done. The killing of the Chief Justice, Benedicto Kiwanuka, and the Archbishop Janani Luma of the Church of Uganda was murdered in February 1977. He was the most senior Anglican bishop in Uganda, a man of genuine moral courage who had publicly protested the regime's violence, who had organized a delegation of bishops to present Amin with a document detailing the atrocities being committed across the country, who had refused to be silent when silence was the only safe option. He was arrested, accused of plotting against the state, and killed. The regime announced that he had died in a car accident. No one believed it. His broken body was returned to his family bearing marks that could not have been made by a car accident. The murder of Luum was Amin's most explicit attack on the institutional structures that still provided Ugandans with some protection from the full weight of the state's violence. The church, the judiciary, the university, these were the spaces where something resembling civil society persisted, where it was still possible to speak carefully about what was happening, where the moral vocabulary for resistance was still being maintained. Amin attacked them deliberately, understanding that the destruction of these institutions would leave the population without the social infrastructure needed to organize resistance. The Entebbe raid of July 1976, the Israeli commando operation that returned 3 hostages held by Palestinian and German hijackers at Entebbe airport, was the moment that exposed the full dimensions of Amin's international situation. The hijackers had been given permission to land at Entebbe. They had received, according to the evidence, Ugandan logistical support. Amin had played his strange theatrical role in the crisis, meeting with the hijackers, appearing on television with the hostages, presenting himself as a mediator while apparently being complicit in the operation's continuation. The Israeli raid, 100 commandos flying 4,000 miles in the darkness, landing at Entebbe, killing the hijackers and the Ugandan soldiers who defended them, losing one of their own officers, and departing with the hostages in under an hour, was a military and propaganda humiliation of the first order. It exposed the Ugandan army's real military capacity, demonstrated that Amin's bluster was not matched by operational capability, and destroyed the international image of invincibility that Amin had been carefully constructing. His response was to murder the Kenyan hostages who had not been evacuated, elderly, infirm people who had been left behind in the chaos of the raid, and to kill Dora Bloch, the elderly Israeli, British hostage who had been hospitalized in Kampala before the raid. These murders were acts of impotent rage. The response of a man whose humiliation required an assertion of power, any assertion of power, regardless of how small and how vicious its target. The world had been watching Amin for 5 years. It had laughed at his absurdities, photographed his medals, reported his declarations. It had, in a fundamental sense, failed to fully reckon with what was happening to the Ugandan people, while the cameras were focused on the spectacle of their tormentor. The estimates of people killed under Amin's rule range from 100,000 to 500,000. The range itself is a measure of the horror. Even the scholars who have spent careers trying to document the murders cannot narrow it further, because the killing was so systematic, so sustained, and so deliberately undocumented that the full scale will never be known. What is known is that every significant ethnic and religious and professional community in Uganda was targeted. The Akoli and Langi decimated in the early years. The Baganda targeted for their connection to the Kabaka. The Asians expelled. The Banyoro, the Langi intellectuals, the Catholic hierarchy, the lawyers, the journalists, all of them reduced, silenced, driven into exile, or into the mass graves that the regime left across the Ugandan countryside. The Nile ran with bodies through the years of Amin's rule. Fishermen on Lake Victoria pulled nets full of the regime's victims. The Owen Falls Dam at Jinja, the hydroelectric infrastructure that powered Uganda's economy, was periodically clogged with the bodies that the Nile carried from the killing grounds of the interior. This was the Pearl of Africa at the height of Idi Amin's power. This was what the Field Marshal's Republic actually looked like from the inside. This was the reality that the OAU summit's diplomatic courtesies and the international press's obsession with Amin's theatrical absurdity had been obscuring. The killings were not a side effect of the regime. They were a 6, Krases if kufadif, tndn tuar adi evaritation ing, Amin needed a war. By 1978, the internal contradictions of 8 years of misrule had accumulated to the point where no domestic policy could address them. The economy was ruined. The professional class was dead, or in exile. The army, the institution on which Amin's entire power rested, was increasingly difficult to control. Its soldiers unpaid for months at a stretch, its internal politics volatile with the ethnic and factional tensions that years of purges and promotions had created. The State Research Bureau was still functional, still capable of terrorizing the population into compliance, but the population it was terrorizing was increasingly impoverished, increasingly desperate, increasingly beyond the reach of the incentives that made compliance rational. Amin's response to domestic crisis was, characteristically, external aggression. In October 1978, the Uganda army invaded Tanzania. The specific pretext involved a Ugandan rebel force that had been operating from Tanzanian territory with the tolerance of President Julius Nyerere, who had never hidden his contempt for Amin or his sympathy for the Ugandans in exile who opposed him. The invasion seized the Kagera salient, a piece of Tanzanian territory north of the Kajare River, and Ugandan soldiers proceeded to commit atrocities against the Tanzanian civilian population that were, even by the standards of the Uganda Army's conduct, remarkable in their brutality. It was, strategically, one of the most self-destructive acts in the history of post-colonial African politics. Julius Nyerere was not Milton Obote. He was not a politician who could be easily frightened, or bought or maneuvered. He was one of the most respected statesmen in Africa, the architect of Tanzanian independence, the philosopher of African socialism. A man whose moral authority on the continent was vast, and whose fury at the murder of Tanzanian civilians was both genuine and politically legitimate in a way that previous criticisms of Amin had never been. He had been waiting, with the specific patience of a man who understood strategy, for exactly this provocation. Tanzania's response was immediate and overwhelming. The Tanzania People's Defense Force, reinforced by Ugandan exile forces organized under the broad umbrella of the Uganda National Liberation Front, crossed the border into Uganda in January 1979. What followed was not a war, it was a campaign, a methodical, organized military advance through Uganda from south to north, town by town and district by district, that exposed the Uganda Army's actual military capacity with brutal clarity. The Uganda Army that had terrorized its own civilian population for 8 years turned out to be, as a fighting force against an organized external enemy, remarkably ineffective. Units that had been built on ethnic loyalty and personal patronage rather than on military professionalism disintegrated under pressure. Officers whose advancement had depended on connections to Amin rather than military competence proved incapable of coordinating effective resistance. Soldiers who had been sustained by looting the civilian population of their own country found that an actual army, with logistics and command, and the morale that comes from fighting for a legitimate cause, was a fundamentally different kind of opponent. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, Amin's most significant external patron, the source of the financial and military support that had kept the regime viable through years of international isolation, sent troops. Several thousand Libyan soldiers arrived in Uganda to support Amin's army. Their presence was militarily irrelevant. They were unfamiliar with the terrain, unfamiliar with the specific dynamics of the East African conflict, and deployed in support of an army that was already disintegrating. Their casualties were significant. Their contribution to the defense of Amin's regime was negligible. The fall of Kampala was not a battle. It was a collapse. In April 1979, the Tanzanian forces and their Ugandan allies entered Kampala. The Uganda army, what remained of it that had not already deserted or defected, fled north. Amin himself fled, not with the dignity of a commander going down with his force, but in the specific, undignified haste of a man who had always prioritized his own survival over everything else, and who understood, with the precision of a lifelong opportunist, exactly when the game was over. He fled to Libya. Gaddafi, who had sent soldiers to die in Uganda in his support, received him. He lived in Libya for several years, a large, loud, unwanted guest, reminiscing about his years of power, apparently genuinely uncomprehending of the scale of what he had done to his country. Continuing to give interviews, in which he offered African politics with the serene confidence of a man who had not yet fully processed the fact that he had been driven out of his own country by a neighboring state that was tired of watching him murder its citizens. He eventually moved to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis, who had been cultivating relationships with Muslim leaders across Africa as part of their broader geopolitical strategy, and who had their own reasons for preferring to have Amin housed comfortably in Jeddah rather than acting as a destabilizing presence in the region, provided him with a villa and a generous stipend. He lived there with several of his wives and many of his children. He ate enormously. He had always been a man of prodigious physical appetites, and he watched television and gave occasional interviews, and apparently spent very little time reflecting on the bodies in the Nile. Back in Uganda, the scale of what he had left behind was only beginning to be understood. What Idi Amin left behind was a country that had been systematically destroyed. The Tanzania-backed government that took power in April 1979. The Uganda National Liberation Front, a coalition of exiled groups whose only real unity was their shared opposition to Amin, discovered immediately that the problems of rebuilding a state that had been deliberately unmade were orders of magnitude more complex than the military campaign that had ended the old regime. Uganda in 1979 was a nation with no functioning economy, no functioning civil service, no functioning judicial system, no functioning educational or medical infrastructure, and a population traumatized at a depth that would take generations to process. The violence did not stop with Amin's departure. This is the aspect of the aftermath that the liberation narrative tends to obscure. The Uganda that emerged from Amin's rule was not healed by his removal. The social and institutional damage he had done created conditions in which new violence could flourish, and it did. The immediate post-Amin period was chaotic. A succession of weak governments, military factions, and continuing atrocities, as the forces that had been organized to fight Amin found, in the absence of that unifying enemy, that their differences were deeper than their coalition had been able to contain. Milton Obote returned from exile. He was elected president in 1980. An election whose fairness was immediately contested, and whose result immediately reignited the conflicts that his first government had generated. The Baganda had not forgotten 1966, and the attack on the Kabaka's palace.